On exploring North Carolina, we spend a lot of time among trees, in coastal bottomlands and at the tops of our highest mountains. One of my favorite books, and a favorite of my children, is The Giving Tree. It reminds us of the value of trees and that we sometimes take them for granted. Today we are going to focus on the forest of North Carolina as the cradle of forestry in America, and what our trees are still giving us. I first asked Bob Slocum, Executive Vice President of the North Carolina Forestry Association in Raleigh, how trees keep giving to North Carolina.
What people should know about the forest industry in North Carolina, it really is twofold, and one is the extent of our forests. In North Carolina, forests represent the dominant land use in this state. 58% of North Carolina is forest land. In fact, there's only three states in the United States that have more forest land than we do, even with all of our urban development and other land uses that have come into North Carolina. The other thing that we should know is that the forest products industry itself is now the state's largest manufacturing industry. The total economic impact of this industry, direct and indirect employment, is estimated at about 272,000 jobs with an annual economic impact of over $30 billion in North Carolina. So our forests represent a tremendous asset, not only for our environment, for wildlife habitat, clean air, clean water, but true economic employment. At North Carolina, our economy was actually built by forest products, and it's still a major factor today.
I asked Bob to explain the difference between direct and indirect economic benefit.
When you look at the direct and indirect economic impact of our industry, the direct impact's pretty easy to understand. That's direct employment in the mills, in the manufacturing facilities that produce forest products. The indirect side probably is a little more, as they say, indirect. There's lots of companies whose sole business it is to produce products or materials used in the forest products industry. Chemicals, for example, that are used in pulp and paper making, equipment used in timber harvesting, equipment that goes into the manufacture of paper, equipment that goes into our sawmills to produce the lumber. All of this gets included as indirect employment, and then you have fuel and lubricants, all that are critical to our industry. And so when you look at the total impact of forest products on the economy of North Carolina, it is dramatic.
It is easy to overlook the ways trees benefit us every day. But Bob Slocum helped me focus on the variety of goods from the woods.
When we talk about the products of the forest and things we use, there's some things that I think everybody understands comes from trees. The lumber that goes into our homes, the wood furniture, the paper that we read every day, the books that that are printed. I think people understand those are products that come from our forest, at least I hope they do. But there are countless thousands of products we use every day that we'd never think about having a wood base. A good example is toothpaste. A cellulosic gum derived from wood is what gives toothpaste its creamy texture and is widely used. A chemical called esters that are derived from wood during the pulp and paper making process give it its flavor, and in fact find their way into citrus drinks to help distribute the citrus flavor in drinks. The lignin that holds wood fibers together is a powerful glue and is actually extracted during the pulp and paper process, and we use that same lignin in wood glues that we use every day. So the products of our forest are really almost countless, and not only do they provide thousands of products we use today, but when you look down the road, they're going to provide us even more in the future.
From its very beginnings, North Carolina has benefited from the tremendous assets of our forest. To learn about our state's involvement in protecting and managing forest resources, we went to a man with two titles: Director of Division of Forest Resources and State Forester Wib Owen.
I guess around the early 1900s, some important folks in state government decided that that our forests need to be protected and looked after and conserved. And so they enacted our first forestry programs, and that has evolved to what we have today. And it does that. It protects and conserves those areas for the people of North Carolina, and it includes protection of wildlife and forest resources and soils and air quality and water quality. And that's why we're in that business. The state is in that business to protect those things for the people of North Carolina. We've got a forest protection section, and they're responsible for fighting wildfires and monitoring disease and insect outbreaks. We also have a forest management section, and that section helps the people of landowners in North Carolina manage their property. They give them advice on forest management and reforestation and afforestation and things like that. And to help those processes, we also have a nursery. And that's available for the people of North Carolina to make sure there's going to be an adequate supply of seedlings and quality seedlings to perpetuate our forest and make sure that we have those in the future.
Whenever you see a bird or wild animal in North Carolina, it probably has its home in the forest. Wib Owen told me about his balancing act as manager of all forest resources, the trees and the things therein.
We're actually charged to manage all of our forest resources, not just the trees that are out there. And that's what we try to do. You have to put on a lot of hats. And so we try to train our folks, and current educations that folks are getting in natural resource schools across the nation are providing for that. But it's important to manage an ecosystem, to manage everything that's going on out there and the interactions of those things. And when you're doing forest management, you're going to have an impact on those things. And so that's what we try to do, is balance, is create a balance.
I asked Wib about the types of state forest and about how state forests differ from state and national parks.
We've got two types of state forests in North Carolina. We have educational state forest, and these are relatively small areas that were set aside to educate the people of North Carolina about our forest resources. But in particular, they're aimed at educating students. And that's the main goal, is that they've worked hard to align their curriculum at the educational state forest with North Carolina Public Schools science curriculum. They'll also have some interpretive trails and some talking trees and things like that, and the public can go out and enjoy these resources also by themselves. Now, our state forests are much larger, and probably the biggest and well-known is Bladen Lake State Forest in Bladen County. These are areas that are set aside for us to do demonstration areas for landowners. There are also excellent opportunities for research, and we do a lot of research on these areas. We do carry on quite a bit of forest management on our state forest, as do the national forest. We provide for other recreational activities on there, but our state forest recreational activities are low-key. They're geared toward hiking, hunting, fishing, wildlife observation or plant observation or nature observation, things like that. And that's where they differ from national parks and state parks, and those areas are of a more developed recreation where they provide camping and things like that we do not provide on a state forest.
On Exploring North Carolina, we have told you about forestry practices in North Carolina and the South in centuries past. Harry Warren of the North Carolina Forestry Museum in Whiteville knows this history well.
Well, the forest industry has always been an important part of North Carolina's history and economy. And this goes way back to before the state even became a state, when we were still a colony of the British Empire. I mean, the British Empire, their power rested on the great wooden sailing fleets that they had. And those sailing fleets were kept afloat by naval stores, that is, tar, pitch, and turpentine. The British, when they saw the great stands of longleaf pines in North Carolina, they must have thought that they had fallen into heaven, because suddenly they had what seemed to be an endless supply of pine trees that could provide not only the wood, but also these very important ingredients, tar, pitch, and turpentine. In fact, the port of Brunswick in the mid-18th century, in the 1750s, was the leading port in the entire British Empire for the export of those crucial items. This did not change at all when we became a country in our own right, the early Republic of the United States. The only thing that changed is that the town of Brunswick no longer existed, but its place was taken by the port of Wilmington, which again became the largest exporter of tar, pitch, and turpentine in the world. Not North Carolina, not the United States, but the entire world. It's hard to underestimate just how important this was and how prolific this industry was. Not only people that were directly related to it, who were scarring the trees and bringing in the crude resin that allowed the turpentine and the tar to be produced from, but also the people that were associated with it, like the coopers, the thousands, probably millions of barrels that had to be created to contain this, the dock workers at Bath and Edenton and Newbern and Wilmington. All of these people were all related to the naval stores industry.
Through the 19th century and into the early 20th century, large-scale turpentining and lumbering continued. But we soon learned that the supply was not endless.
You had these huge swaths of trees in the western part of the state and in the eastern, northeastern part of the state that really had not been tapped into. And these men looked at these and they saw what looked like an endless natural resource. So they did what was natural to them. They just started chopping down trees that supplied the wood for a lot of the building that was going on in the industrial Northeast at the time. And there wasn't a whole lot of thought given to replanting or regeneration of the forest, because it just looked like there was so much of it out there.
The nation's voracious appetite for timber and the absence of management and reforestation did not go unnoticed. Near the beginning of the 20th century, George Vanderbilt, who had just purchased a huge tract that would later become Pisgah National Forest, saw the need to take action. Jennifer O'Leary, interpretive specialist for the Cradle of Forestry of America near Brevard, picks up the story.
When George Vanderbilt first purchased what became his private forest, Pisgah Forest, he noted that there were really two needs that he could really help meet with this beautiful forest that was surrounding him. A first need being to help put a timber supply for the growing market, and a second need to meet being that the degradation of the land was first becoming apparent in the form of erosion, cattle grazing and burning practices, timber harvesting, of course. Vanderbilt, being the progressive-minded thinker that he was, and also the businessman that he was, noted that this area offered a great potential to be utilized to meet both those needs and to really become a proving ground for technical or practical forestry.
To take care of his vast holdings, Vanderbilt brought in two of the world's most eminent foresters, the first being Gifford Pinchot, who would later become the first chief of the U.S. Department of Agriculture Forest Service and governor of Pennsylvania. The man who made the biggest impact on forestry practices, however, was Dr. Carl A. Schenck, who founded the first school of forestry in America on Vanderbilt's estate.
One of the things that Schenck tried to instill in his students that he knew was an important concept, a foundational concept for forestry to really take hold in the United States, was that practicing scientific forestry made sense. Not just common sense, but it could also make economic sense. That actually applying a hands-on and scientific approach to forest management would result in a profitable management system for large tracts of forests.
Jennifer took Exploring North Carolina on a quick tour of the campus of the first School of Forestry.
This is one of several original buildings at the Cradle of Forestry. This is the Ranger's Dwelling, built in 1882. Beginning in 1898, students at the Biltmore School of Forestry ate 2 meals a day here. In the yard, seedlings were planted, and they were planted in the forest nearby. This was one of the favorite buildings at the Biltmore Forest School, the commissary. Here, students could get pork and beans, a slice of hoop cheese, and they could pick up their mail. Here they even played horseshoes, right here in the front yard. And here at the Cradle of Forestry, you'll see the classroom building of the Biltmore Forest School, the first school of forestry in the United States, established in September 1898. It was in this simple classroom that Dr. C.A. Schank, a highly trained German forester, conducted classes 3 to 4 hours a morning, 6 days a week on the principles of modern forestry.
Although the Biltmore School of Forestry was only in operation for about 13 years, the legacy of the Biltmore School of Forestry is that many of its students went on to become state, local, and national leaders in forest management, and they really helped sow the seeds of conservation as it is applied to managing forests on the landscape, not only privately, but also publicly.
Randy Burgess is the current successor to Dr. Carl Schank as he manages the great national forest we still know today as Pisgah.
We were fortunate enough that George Vanderbilt lands became available, and his widow was willing to sell land to the National Forest, and the Pisgah National Forest were established in 1916. Well, many of the uses of national forests have remained the same since the early establishment in the early 1900s. Primarily at that time, they were established for protection of watersheds and also to provide forage and timber. In 1960, the Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Act was passed by Congress, which directed the Forest Service to manage for multiple uses and provide a variety of services and products, and we're still operating under that direction today. Well, management of our timber resources is part of the multiple uses that we manage for in providing these products for the American public. Many people think of the Forest Service and sometimes confuse us as being more of a preservation-oriented agency, but actually we operate under a conservation principles, which means wise use of our resources. And that is, in essence, how we manage our timber resources. We ensure that we're providing a sustainable yield of products for today's public, and also that we're ensuring that there's a sustainable yield for future generations as well.
In virtually all conversations, I kept hearing about the science of forestry. So I asked Wib Owen, State Forester, and Bob Slocum of the North Carolina Forestry Association if it really is a science.
I think forestry is called a science because of all of the scientific curricula and background that students are exposed to when they're in the forestry program. They have soil science, that they need to be familiar with soil properties, and botany so that they understand plant properties. And they also have pathology, entomology, and then the mathematical science is the economics and calculus. Those things are all important.
When we talk about the science of forestry, it's always fun for me to relate a story that happened to me when I was a field forester in Virginia one time, and I went to a career day sponsored by a local high school, and the parents of a student came up to me and said they really wanted their son to go into forestry because he wasn't any good in math and science. And it took me back. I didn't really realize there was that perception out there. They said they thought it would be really cool for him to sit in a fire tower. And that's not what foresters do. I think that, you know, maybe some people don't understand the education that goes into a professional forester. There's lots of things that a forester has to know. Tree biology or plant biology is critical. We have to know how plants and trees grow. Soils play a tremendous role in not only what species grow where, but how productive they're going to be. Forest hydrology. Most clean water comes from our forest. And so knowing hydrology and how forests interact with that hydrology is critical. Math is a big component of professional forestry. We have to be able to estimate tree volumes, tree growth, know how that's going to play out in a sawmill or a pulp and paper mill from the standpoint of yields of products. So forestry is truly a broad science.
It is no secret that we are losing open lands and forest lands to development. I ask our guest how we should deal with this change in our landscape and how important forests are to North Carolina's future.
Well, we're working in partnerships with state agencies and local communities to look at ways that we can minimize or offset the loss of the open space. Some of those options might be working with landowners to ensure that maybe there's incentives provided to keep working farms going, lands and forest production. We're also looking at options for conservation easements to be placed on these lands if they're slated for development, and also looking at working with local communities for low-impact development techniques that would minimize the impact from the loss of those lands.
Our forests provide tremendous wildlife habitat, recreational opportunities, clean air, clean water, just about all of the environmental benefits that we really cherish, our forests produce. An interesting side note, I guess, in terms of a little statistic, for every pound of wood that a tree grows, it takes in 1.5 pounds of carbon dioxide and generates 1 pound of oxygen. So we have millions of acres of individual carbon sequestration machines growing all around us. And, you know, to put a value on that would be incredibly difficult, but it's almost incalculable. So our forests represent a tremendous benefit to the quality of life to the citizens of North Carolina.
That's what makes our state great. That's our vast forests. That's why people want to come here. That's to enjoy those things and to get out and enjoy nature. And that's why North Carolina is what it is right now. It's a big part of it. So we have to do our best to protect those things and conserve and make sure we have them for future generations.